That CPD Show. Welcome back to That CPD Show. My name is Chris, and today my guest is Glen Scrivener. Glen is the CEO and Evangelism Director of Speak Life, an organization that exists to re-evangelize church and world through captivating Christ-centered communication, including the 3-2-1 course. Glen hosts a YouTube account which has almost 70,000 subscribers, which is very, very good. And Glen is also the author of the excellent book, I have it here, The Air We Breathe, how we all came to believe in freedom, kindness, progress, and equality. Glen, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. Well, it's great to have you, and we're going to dive into the book, The Air We Breathe, which I have to say I've read it and I love it, and I think it's a book that I would encourage everyone to read. Just an excellent book, and we will be diving into that because I really want to encourage everyone that's watching this to really to interact with the book. But there is a tradition on this podcast that we don't just sort of dive into things that are going to be developmental and helping ministers. We also talk about dessert. And I think everyone wants to know, Glen, what is your favorite dessert?
Yes, it's I'm sure on the tip of everybody's tongue. I'm a real sweet tooth, so anything sugary, you've already got me. As an Australian, I guess I should go for something like pavlova. I do like a pavlova with some sort of passion fruit coulis and that sort of thing, or maybe like lemon curds, sort of. But probably chocolate. I'm so boring though. My wife will always predict what I'll get, and she nails it every single time. It's so embarrassing. Glenn will go for the chocolate brownie with chocolate fudge sauce, sprinkled with chocolate. That's probably what I'll go for. But yeah, I wish I was more. I wish I was less boring than that. But that's probably what I go for.
Well, I mean, I don't think you can ever go wrong with a brownie. It's a classic choice, and so the big question, of course, is. What to you is a good brownie? Do you prefer it on the cakey side or on like the kind of more like dessert need a spoon side?
Depends. I mean, I'm definitely going to have some vanilla ice cream with this, perhaps vanilla ice cream and cream. So if I have that amount of wetness, I can deal with a crispy brownie. Otherwise, I want it molten at its core.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's almost not, when it's too cake-like, I think it feels like it moves away from brownie.
Yes.
Is the best is when it is, like you said, molten to the core, because
was that the right answer? Did I give you the right answer? I don't know.
Well, I mean,
I'm questioning myself now.
Well, no, I think that dessert is in the eye of the beholder, as they say, and so I'm thinking that if that's what's right for you, I feel like I've become a relativist.
Is everyone quite grown up on your podcast? Do people go for a cheese board and that sort of thing?
I've had one cheese board. Right. Most people,
who went for the cheese board? What they sound like a real grown up.
It is, I believe it was someone called Stuart, who is the general manager of Assemblies of God GB.
Right, exactly.
So Stuart Keir, yeah,
exactly, yeah.
So someone that's going to know what he wants, absolutely, yeah.
Actual maturity as opposed to
a very, very mature choice. Although the overwhelming top one, of course, is going to be like apple crumble.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. What, with custard?
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting because some people like it with custard, some people like it with ice cream, some people like it with custard and ice cream, some people like it with cream, and so I think there's interesting choice. I'm happy with whatever. So yeah.
Just fill my belly with fat and sugar.
That'll work. Yeah, so it's a good choice, and I do believe some people have gone for brownie before. So you're not alone. Now I
thought everyone would have gone for brownie. Okay, all right.
I mean, you're never going to go wrong with a brownie. I always think it's a solid choice, and it's one of those ones where if you see it at a restaurant, you're going to say, okay, look, I know where I stand. I mean, you can still get a bad brownie, but you never really get a truly you never go, oh, I regret that. It's always in the realm of, no, I've had a bad crumble before at a restaurant, and that truly was one of the most terrible things I've ever had.
I've rarely regretted a dessert, though. I've gotten jealous at somebody else out ordering me.
Yeah.
I'm quite competitive. I want to win the order, but I've never regretted.
Yeah. Oh, I've regretted the only thing I've regretted was the crumble, and that's because it was a deconstructed crumble, which I feel like we're diving into all sorts of levels of things
Is
here.
that a thing? That's a thing. Deconstructed.
apparently so. So
Ever
it's
since
deconstructed.
Foucault, we've been deconstructed
Yeah.
relationships.
So it came and it was a bowl of stewed fruit, a bowl of granola,
Oh no. What?
and
They
that was
no, what?
crumble.
They might as well just give you like a bowl of flour, some sugar, some eggs. It's like do the
It's-
work, restaurant.
exactly. Which I feel like, when we're, if we're talking about deconstruction, you can use that one in one of your videos
I
and
will. This is
you know,
where it's going, people. Yeah.
exactly.
Come
Yes. Well,
back
that's
to
what happens.
Jesus. Or it'll be deconstructed puddings for the rest of your day. Yeah.
That's it. So yeah, so I would definitely say that's the only time I've truly been disappointed. Apart from that, most things are absolutely
It's a
fine.
sign of civilizational collapse, if you ask me. But yes.
Well, yes, I feel
Yeah.
like we'll dive into that one when we get
Yeah.
to talking about your book as well. So as goes the crumble, as goes society.
Yeah. So goes culture. Yeah.
Amazing. All right. Well, Brownie, great choice there. Let's move on. We're going to talk to you about the air we breathe today. I mean, it's what a segue. Can I
Yeah.
firstly just say, yeah, from crumble to a book that's all about how we came to believe in equality and progress and things like that. And what I love about the book is it's so evangelistic in nature, and it's written to the Christian and to the non-Christian. But I always think it takes this an interesting path because it's not what I would class as the kind of how to how to kind of tell your story, sell your story, the kind of sales tactic end of evangelism.
Mm.
Neither is it the sort of real apologetics. Here's premise one, premise two, premise three. It
Mm-hmm.
very much takes a different path. Talk to me about the path that you wanted to take with this book and why you've kind of taken that approach, which is different from those kind of traditional ends of the evangelistic spectrum.
Yeah, I sometimes get identified as an apologist. I don't really identify myself as an apologist. I've got all sorts of question marks myself over apologetics. If what people mean by apologetics is just thoughtful, contextualized evangelism that takes questioners and their questions seriously, if that's what you mean by apologetics, sign me up. I'm happy to be an apologist in that sense. But if it means a kind of intellectual stepping stones that assume that your listener is neutral and that you can sort of through argumentation move them closer to the kingdom simply through reason and argumentation. If that's what people mean by apologetics, I'm out in that sense. But my first book that I wrote over 10 years ago now was the whole analogy for the book was the Christian house is like the Christian faith is like a house that is really difficult to get a handle on the outside. And my role is not really to give you stepping stones to come into the house. My role is really hospitality to sort of fling open the doors and say, come on inside. I know it looks bonkers from the outside, and you have no idea how this part relates to that part. But I think it's the sort of thing that you have to enter to understand. And so let me do my best attempt at a Christianity 101, which is basically a house tour, and I'll take you into this room of the house that explores what we mean by God, and this house and this room of the house that explores what we mean by the world, and this room that describes what we mean by ourselves and you. And then we sort of go to the kitchen, and you can sit down and you can ask me all your questions. But I don't start with questions. I don't start with apologetics. I don't start with argumentation. I start with just trying to tell the Christian story. And after I wrote that book, it was interesting because somebody sort of said to me, "I like that you don't do the stepping stones thing, but isn't it true that in Western culture we have kind of grown up, if not at the heart of the Christian house, we've kind of grown up in a Christianized edifice, right? We are in this thing called Western society or whatever it is that has been Christianized over 2,000 years, and that has had its effect. And so that some of what evangelism is not so much assuming that the unbeliever is completely outside the Christian faith. Some of what evangelism is pointing to the assumptions that your non-Christian friend makes that are remarkably Christian-ish. And is there a way of telling the story of Christian history and the Christianized values that we now take for granted, where you basically say to your secular friend, hey, you believe in stuff like human rights and human dignity and equality and compassion and freedom and progress, and you think that stuff is utterly normal and neutral, and you think that stuff is just obvious and that we just reason our way towards those views, that's not true. You hold those views for some remarkably Christian ish reasons. And so I just want to tell you the story of Christian history over the last 2,000 years to give you the sense of where you actually stand. And where you stand is not as far outside of Christian influence as you might think you are. So it's not so much, I'm not trying to get people to take a leap of faith. It's to point out that history has already taken some remarkable leaps in the direction of human equality and compassion and progress and these sorts of things, which have some very particularly Christian underpinnings. And I don't want you to leap up to Christian faith. I want you to recognize you're already dangling in thin air and you need some ground beneath your feet. And let me tell you the Jesus story again as a way of grounding what you already believe rather than so much asking you to leap up to a thing that you don't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that completely makes sense. I think it does kind of speak to uh, a kind of how what are the things we emphasize in when we're talking about the gospel, because I think what you're emphasizing there is it feels like something different. Maybe you can tease this out for me, because I think some people, they don't know where to start when it comes to the gospel. They're kind of going, okay, well, is it have I got to come in and kind of tell people that they're a sinner? Okay, well, if I do that, that might have a certain effect. But then I don't quite, we can come in a different angle. And what when we emphasize and talk to people about the Christian story, about the gospel, where do we start? Where do we what do we emphasize? What is that? What you're trying to is there's almost like a different emphasis that you're bringing through. That is that you're bringing in people into the story, into something that they already can hold, rather than trying to convince someone of sin. Now, I'm sure that comes in later, and we have to talk about sin. We have to talk about all those different things. But it feels like it's a different starting point. Have I got? Am I getting you right there?
Possibly. I mean, if it's just about how do you share your faith with your non-Christian friend or neighbor, I've written a book called How to Speak Life, in which I just have a bunch of questions like, kind of what do you make of Jesus, and the much more classical ideas of yeah, who we are, who Jesus is, our sin problem, uh, and what he has done about it, and so if it's about personal evangelism, then I guess we can have that kind of conversation. But really, I'll tell you the story of my friend Sally. So like Sally is just a regular secular person who thinks of herself as utterly a secular person. And I remember her saying to me one time, "Of course, you realize I could never be a believer, Glenn." And it was just the certainty with which she said I could never be a believer, that she feels constitutionally unable to do this thing called faith. And she looks at me and she looks at my wife and she says, "Okay, you two, you've got the faith gene or whatever it is. Like midichlorians, racing through Jedi blood. You've got this thing called faith deep within you." And sometimes she looks at us and she thinks she dodged a bullet. Sometimes, though, she looks at us and she thinks we hit the jackpot. But she definitely thinks we've got this faith thing and she absolutely doesn't. And what I want to do with Sally evangelistically, one of the things I want to do is to wake her up to the fact that she's already exercising faith all the time. Um, she already believes in human worth and dignity and equality, and she already believes in freedom and progress and compassion, consent and enlightenment, and all these things that I talk about in the book. She already believes in those things, and she doesn't have a logical argument for any of them. And like none of the values by which she navigates her life have come to her through scientific experimentation or logical deduction. Like she hasn't waited for a symposium um, to discover whether humans actually have value or not. She really believes in that kind of stuff, and she really believes in that kind of stuff for what's anonymous to her, but what's invisible to her, but what is actually true for some profoundly Christian reasons. She believes these things, and so what I'm really wanting to do with the secular people in my life is wake them up to the fact that there's no such thing really as secular. Like, you cannot live without faith. You're constantly exercising faith. And the non Christian might look to the Christian and think, oh, they've got these faith muscles that they're flexing all the time. And I just want to say to them, you are using faith muscles all the time. Um, and let me reorient you to the actual story that makes sense of the beliefs that you already have, and that actually, points out the one who is truly worthy of your trust, and his name is Jesus. So it's kind of it's beneath tactics. If we want to talk tactics, then I've got a whole bunch of them. But beneath the tactics, there's a conviction that I've got that my friends are not incapable of faith. That is a secular myth, and I want to bust that myth.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is such an important thing because I think if we just get into what's the tactic, we are going to literally miss the wood. And and a certain amount of that is not it's not a bad thing, but and can be helpful. But let's get kind of to that deeper level and see what's actually going on. And I think this is what the Air We Breathe does so well, and makes that case. And it's certainly something. What you talk about how the Christian story has influenced Western society. And it got me thinking as I was reading it, I was kind of, and it's been one of those things that as we come up in the kind of, in the church conversation, in things like that, we end up talking about, the church, and we talk about the world. And you talked about, how we think about the world. But if we've got a world that's been influenced by the Christian story, and maybe they don't recognize it, how do we think about the world? Because I think sometimes we have this kind of real dichotomy that there's the church, there's the world. They are diametrically opposed, and in many senses they are. But there's in one sense that you're arguing that they've actually been influenced, especially in Western society, by that Christian story. So how can we think about the world now that with that kind of view that actually they have been influenced somehow by Christianity?
Jesus told that parable in Matthew 13, and the equivalent is in Mark chapter 4. And it begins with this very practical seed sowing parable about how the kingdom grows. And that's really good for your personal evangelism to recognize you'll have all these different soil types around you, and there are those who are very hard to the gospel, and then there's the shallow soil, and there's the thorns, and then there's the good soil. And you've got the same seed, which is the word of God, and you scatter that seed, and it'll have different kinds of effects. But there's just one job that we have constantly, sow the seed, sow the seed, sow the seed. And then at the end of Matthew 13, Jesus summarizes all the parables from that chapter, and he said, the kingdom is like a mustard seed, that though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet it grows to become the largest of garden plants, so large that even the birds perch in its branches. And you can ask yourself, well, where did we last see those birds in Matthew chapter 13? Well, the first soil type, remember, the very first thing Jesus said about seed and birds was that as you begin that process, the birds come and snatch away the seed. And Jesus says this is like satanic opposition to the gospel, kind of people snatching away the gospel seed. And yet by the end of Matthew chapter 13, the birds, where are the birds now? Well, after a very long process of the seed becoming the mustard tree, after a very long process, suddenly the birds are not bigger than the seed. Now, the kingdom is much bigger than the birds. And the birds are they might be pecking away at that tree. And even they are now perching in the branches of the tree that Christ's word has grown. And that is what the world is like. What is the world like? My friends and your friends, they might peck away at the gospel, and they might oppose the gospel in all sorts of ways. And the Bible tells us, the New Testament is very clear that the world is opposed to the gospel in that sense. You might think of John's sense of the world, or Paul's sense of this age and this present evil age. That's all true. But what's fascinating about a Christianized culture, you still have birds, and they still oppose the work of the kingdom. But where are they perched? And what you have is a whole bunch of people who oppose the gospel for some profoundly Christian ish kind of reasons. And my friends, just as your friends, I'm sure, Chris, they disagree with Christians because they think that Christianity is unequal, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti science, restrictive, and regressive. That's a pretty common shopping list of the sorts of accusations that the world makes towards the church. But what do you notice about those things? They are the reverse of the values of the kingdom that Jesus has grown. And my book goes into 7 values. And the 7 values that I talk about are equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. So why is it that the world particularly hates the church for being unequal, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, and regressive? It's because they are perched in the branches of a kingdom that Jesus has grown. And I think that that's really, really helpful as my friend objects to this, that, or the other in the Bible. Um, it's really helpful to figure out what is it that my friend is really prizing in that moment. He really loves the idea of equality, and that's why he's using the word bigot right now. Or he really believes in progress, and that's why he's just called us regressive. And tugging at those threads, I find really, really important in personal evangelism. And then in cultural analysis, isn't it interesting to look out at a culture that sort of assumes these values? And so much of the culture wars, they're just people, they're hurling Bible verses at each other. They've just forgotten the references. And so my view of the world can be informed by just thinking more carefully about the Christianization processes that has happened. And my view of my friends and neighbors and personal evangelism, I think can be helped by helping my friends who are the birds to identify the kind of branch that they are perched on. And I think as we sort of look at our feet and figure out what we are assuming in this gospel conversation, I think we'll get a lot closer to the values and to the gospel that Jesus proclaimed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you see that with I listen to some atheists on YouTube or something, and what you hear is quite, similar to Protestant Christianity, just removing God from it. It's still quite an iconoclastic
Yeah.
position, and so there's so much that still crosses over. They still have this wealth inheritance of
Hmm.
Christianity coming through their worldview. They've just rejected the God part of that.
Yeah.
But maybe they just don't. Yeah, they don't understand, like you said, the branch that they're actually
Hmm.
perched on. And so, absolutely fascinating, and just really changes how you think about that person's. If it's a friend and they're bringing the reason why they don't believe, and you can actually,
Hmm.
wow, yeah, actually, I can agree with that. And let's tease that out. Let's talk about why you believe that. And I think there's something that's really, it invites you into a conversation, doesn't it? And I think
Yeah.
that's the important part here. Um, I'd love to dive into some of the book, because I think, because I really want to encourage, like, all ministers watching, listening to this, to read the book. One of the things that really struck me, chapter one, you talk about the cross. Now, obviously, we all know about the cross, but of course, do we? Uh, and I think that's one of the things that you talk about, is the cross being a symbol that's changed over time. Just dive me into that, and dive our listeners and watchers into that, about the how much that's changed over time, because we have people that wear crosses around our necks right now, and we don't even think about it. So to kind of get me into that worldview of how we got to here, with now, I mean, obviously, in a short amount of podcast, we can't go through the whole history of Christianity in 5 minutes, but how do we get to here with the cross being what it is today?
Mm. Well, I think getting back to what it would have meant for the centurion at the foot of the cross, what a revolution in his understanding it was for the centurion who looks up at a bleeding victim who he has just put to death, and he says, "Surely this is the Son of God." This is the most like astonishing revolution in understanding, because to a Roman, what did the cross mean? Well, the cross was the the most extreme penalty for the lowest kind of victim, for the lowest slave. It was the slave's death, and it was a massive placard that was saying to the population, and especially to the slave population, "Do not rebel. This is the shameful end we make of such wretches." And I and we just have such a sanitized vision of the cross, as you say. We just wear these pieces of jewelry around our neck. And how did it go from this method of execution to being a piece of jewelry? It really struck home with me. I went to the Colosseum a few years ago, and going around, and it's so fascinating to see how inventive the Romans were at their brutality. And coming up with these ways of killing people for sport so that tens of thousands of people would kind of cheer. And it was an utterly brutal time. And as I was touring around and seeing the different ways that the Romans had devised to put people to death, I came across this large cross. And I'd already written the book. I'd already done the research for The Air We Breathe. Nevertheless, seeing the cross, my first thought was, oh, the Roman Catholic Church must have gotten permission to put up a cross. And I guess Rome is very Catholic, and so I guess they have an understanding with the Colosseum. And then it just took me about 3 seconds to think, you moron, Glenn, you total moron. Like the church didn't put the cross into the Colosseum. The church took the cross out of the Colosseum and put it in our places of worship. And that's the astonishing thing, is that it finds its natural habitat at the Colosseum. This was one of the slow ways to watch slaves die. If you wanted a fast way, you'd throw people to the lions or whatever else you'd do. But off to one corner, you'd crucify some people, and that was part of that was just part of the brutality, part of the entertainment. And that is where a cross truly belongs. And I remember after leaving the Colosseum, I went up the hill, the Palatine Hill, and there's a museum there. Palatine Hill was where all the Caesars lived, the palace. And there's a famous piece of graffiti there, scratched into the Palatine Hill. And it's the oldest depiction of the cross. And perhaps it's 2nd or 3rd century AD. And it's just got this figure dying on a cross with the head of a donkey. Like, he is a man, but he's portrayed as an ass, like a total moron. And it's Christ, right? And we know it's Christ because next to the cross, there's somebody with his arm raised in veneration, worshipping this crucified figure. And the caption just says, Alexamenos, the name of the dude at the foot of the cross, Alexamenos worships his God. And it's just dripping with spite and scoffing and sneering derision. What an idiot. What an idiot is this Alexamenos worshipping his donkey of a god on a cross. And very few things can communicate to us in the year 2025 what a scandal the cross is, except to go back to Roman times and to put yourself into some Roman sandals and to understand what the cross meant for them. The idea that any god would descend to a cross and be worthy of worship is one thing. But of all the people to be proclaiming this, the Jews, like, were proclaiming this. Like, this began as this Jewish movement, the Messiah, the one who is our maker, the Son of the Father, filled with the Spirit, the one who is our maker. Not even Zeus, right? But a god so much more supreme than the little godlets of the Greek and Roman imagination. The God of all, descending to the slave's death. It is the most revolutionary idea that any human could contemplate. No wonder it has led to the greatest revolution in culture that there has ever been. But the eruption that kind of has released this revolution that's rippled on into the 21st century is God on a cross. And actually doing some history really gets you back to ground zero in a quite confronting way.
I remember watching a Tom Holland video that I think was the History Hit podcast that he was on. Brilliant. I know had a little interaction with that video, and I think Rationality Rules. I saw that one recently around that video, and I remember thinking, I watched that video and thought, oh yeah, I've seen that video. And Tom Holland's talking about at some points just what it's like, or what it was like in the Roman Empire, and how slaves were treated, how women were treated, and when you go back to the world of the Romans, the Greeks, you just see a completely different world to what we had, and I mean, quite startlingly so. That to think that we're just like the Romans, aren't we? Well, not really at all. and I think, I mean, that speaks to one of your other points is equality. That we have this kind of notion now that of equality, and that's come in, and we can see that I think Jesus being the start of that, Paul then taking that forward in the New Testament in terms of applying that into a first century context. And But what we've seen is that equality has grown and grown and grown, and now we get to the point where equality between male and female, we take it more and more for granted. Maybe not fully there yet, but there's more equality that's there than that's ever been, and we've grown to that place of equality. But I wonder whether in society is there a chance that can go too far? Can
Oh
you
yeah.
take that very Christian value and then
Yeah.
overstep its bounds?
Yeah.
So talk to me about like that. Maybe it's in the context of equality, but it could be other things as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But how we know that the is looking at how we've progressed on these kind of things and how the Christian worldview that's unfolded over 2,000 years has done that, and then can it go too far?
Oh yeah, 100%. And the sort of the final sections of the book, I really get into what post-Christianity looks like. And in so many ways, post-Christianity is far worse than pre-Christianity. Um, at the time of recording, in Westminster this week, we're having two votes that are happening. One in which some amendments to a crime and policing bill that are being debated today in the Houses of Parliament. One of the proposed amendments is to make abortion available for any reason up to birth. And then on Friday, there's a debate to allow sort of assisted dying. Now, what's interesting is that um, in the Roman world, uh, yes, you could have an abortion for any reason, not just up to birth, but beyond birth. And infanticide was absolutely common. It was so common that Roman historians managed to find a couple of cultures that didn't practice infanticide, and they were shocked that anyone wouldn't kill their disabled and girls. It's usually the disabled and girls that lose out with abortion and with infanticide, and so that was rife in the ancient world. Euthanasia, there's no sense of the sanctity of life to a Roman, and in so many cultures, yes, you would bump off the elderly, and so we are now at, we are now at a place where 73 million abortions are carried out in this world every year globally. 73 million. Only 60 million people die every year. We put to death 73 million. What's different between, though, the post-Christian sense um, of abortion and the pre-Christian sense of abortion is we now do it in the name of compassion. We now do it in the name of its healthcare, which obviously, Christians have been at the forefront of inventing hospitals and the way we think of the welfare state and the way we think of the NHS and hospital care. But now we do it in the name of gender equality, right? An ancient person would still be just as brutal towards the weakest members of society. They would be just as brutal. We still manage to be incredibly brutal to the weakest members of our human society, and we don't have equality. We put to death 73 million members of the human species every single year. We don't have equality. We now have it as a slogan. And this is what's happened with post-Christianity. We have equality, we have compassion, and we have learnt from the Good Samaritan to be compassionate. We've learnt from Jesus, who was the fittest, who was sacrificed for we the weakest, so that we the weakest might survive and thrive and pass on his compassion revolution. He is the overturning of the natural way towards cruelty and dominance. He has given to the world this love of compassion. But in a post-Christian society, divorced from Jesus, divorced from the Jesus story, divorced from every other moral virtue, compassion is just a virtue running amok all by itself, and it becomes a slogan that then justifies any old cruelty. And so people will put to death 73 million members of the human species, but now now it's worse because we do it in the name of compassion. And we do it while thinking that we are good people. The ancient Romans, they just thought it was a necessity. And life is cruel. And to be honest, they faced so many more hardships than we face, and we don't know how good we've got it. And I've got a heck of a lot more sympathy for a Roman practicing these kinds of cruelties than a modern person, because we are so much more privileged. But a Roman did that kind of stuff because life is cruel. What are you going to do? We are repaganizing in the post-Christian West, but we're doing it with some Christian clothing on, and we're doing it mouthing some Christian-ish values. And in one sense, it's even worse now. Post-Christianity is even worse because we are doing some profoundly anti-Christian things, but sometimes we're giving it Christian clothing, which makes the hypocrisy all the more wild.
Yeah, I sent a letter to my MP this morning, and I saw the bill that had come up, and the response I got was, this is the woman's right to choose, and so that value of
Mm.
equality or compassion now has risen to a level that now that can mean that abortion up until birth is now can be seen as an acceptable practice. And I think it just makes me think: how did we get there? How
Right.
how how did we get? Because and this is where I think it's really interesting, because I think for those people that would not profess Christianity, they have to kind of think, well, where does that moral imperative to say it's a woman's right to choose, for instance,
Mm.
where does that come from? Because and you argue against a kind of scientific outlook on this. So talk to me about that. About okay, if not God, where are we getting that?
Mm.
Where are people getting that moral imperative from? Because it seems to me that becomes difficult.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It becomes difficult, but having an understanding of how Christianity and then post-Christianity has formed us will really help in some of these conversations. So let me see if I can take us along some of the journey. I think Christianity really invented the person as we now understand the person, and a lot of it was actually um, a whole bunch of theologians nerding out on Trinitarian theology and figuring out what is a person. Like if we say that Jesus is a different person to the Father, but he's the same being, oh my goodness, what do we even mean by person? And interestingly, in the hammering out of Trinitarian theology, you start to get this sense of what a person is, and then what is a human nature? Because if Jesus has a divine nature and a human nature, we need to figure out what that even is. And so you get a whole bunch of theologians kind of putting a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into hammering out how is it that the singular Jesus of Nazareth became man for all men in the most universal sense. Well, that must mean, mustn't it, that both men and women share the same human nature? Because Jesus, he had to become a human to save humans, but he didn't have to become a woman to save women. Why is that? Well, because women share the same nature as men. We are one in nature, and that's really important. And then you might want to continue to think through theologically. Well, at what point did the incarnation happen? Was it Christmas? Actually, no, it was 9 months before that. At the Annunciation, the angel says to Mary, what is conceived in you is from the Holy Spirit. So at what point did the Son of God join the human race? Well, at conception. Well, there's definitive proof. You can go to the Psalms and figure out that life begins at conception. But even more centrally, you can go to the person of Christ. And when did Christ begin his human life? At conception. And he became man for all men. And so there is an equality with all people that is proclaimed in that. And there is compassion for all people because he identifies with the weak as the weakest possible member of the human family, a single cell in Mary's womb. And he's the sort of Lord who will go to that cross and die in weakness to have compassion on those who cannot save themselves. So Christians come to have this very particular view of the dignity of the unborn because of Christmas and Easter, right? Because of Christmas, um, because of Christmas, life begins at conception. Because of Easter, we know how to treat even the weakest members of society. And in solidarity, we will do all we can to protect them and save them, right? So that kind of gives us that sort of sense. And out of that kind of understanding, you start to get a language of human rights, which is a wonderful thing. And in the medieval period, the canon lawyers were hammering out not only the fact that if I have money, I don't just have an obligation to give to the needy person, but the needy person has a right to provision and protection. And that's just a real novelty in sort of human civilizations, and the idea that you can't you can't lose your rights in the shuffle. You can't have your rights traded away for the greater good. I have rights to provision and protection. Now, that becomes very much a shield to protect the weak. But what then happens to a culture that divorces itself from the Christian story and then just wants to contemplate humans by themselves? Well, then you've got rights with no responsibilities, right? And then rights over time start to be less of a shield that protects the weak. They start to be a sword. I've got a right. And my right now is a sword that I can use and wield it against you. Um, and the invention of the individual that happens all throughout medieval times where my human rights can't get lost in the shuffle. I'm an individual with rights. That's a beautiful thing. The invention of the individual is a wonderful thing. But what happens in post-Christianity and what happens with the affluence of the West is we become individualists, and the individual gives way to individualism, and my rights get elevated, and all ideas of obligation and responsibility and family and society and all that kind of stuff goes by the wayside. And in a post-Christianized sense, we hold on to certain parts of the Christian story that really suit us, and we become very entitled. We become rights driven as a sword rather than as a shield for the weak. We become individualists. And instead of equality being the sort of thing where everybody is welcome at the same table no matter who you are, which is the Christian vision, we're all at one table, sharing bread and wine, remembering one Savior, all brothers and sisters. That's what equality means. And instead of equality meaning that, it starts to mean equality is I I ought to be able to get up, as far up my ladder of individual achievement and affluence as you. And it becomes a very individualized sense of equality that forgets all bonds of like communion, all bonds of obligation and service and love. And it's kind of why non-Christian cultures could look at the West and they are baffled by how individualistic we are. They are baffled by the way we treat our elderly. They're baffled by our social care system, in which, we're just basically paying nurses from the rest of the world to look after our elderly because we're not doing it in our own families. And it's another instance of post-Christian morality being in so many ways worse than non-Christian or pre-Christian morality. And understanding that all those different things are going on at once in me as a Christian, because I'm just as individualist as my neighbors. They're going on in me, but they're also going on in the seeker. They're also going on in Westminster right now in all the arguments that are being made right now. It's just worth being alive to the different values that people are having and why they're forwarding the arguments that they've got. They don't really articulate their foundations. But if you can figure out what their foundations are, I think you can talk a lot more persuasively with them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just an incredibly fascinating thought that, and it just makes my mind go in all sorts of different directions there for certain. There's one thing I mentioned earlier that I saw a recent video of yours. You were critiquing rationality rules as kind of an atheist YouTuber, and he was kind of having a little pop at Tom Holland and his excellent book Dominion. And one of the things that really struck me that he said was, in one sense, you can Christianity is almost kind of claiming all the good stuff and rejecting all the bad stuff. It's like anything that's good's happened, that's because of Christianity. Anything that's bad that's happened, well, that was someone else. But you actually directly kind of hit this or pre-hit this in your book, because you talk about the importance of kind of owning what's crooked. And to talk to me about that, and maybe how we as churches, as ministers, can get better at owning what's crooked. Because I don't think it's not your thesis, and not Tom's thesis either, of let's just claim everything that's good in Western society comes from Christianity, and then everything that's bad doesn't. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. and I think that's so important because yeah, this idea can be heard of as everything that's ever good has come from Christianity, and if you don't like something, oh, I'm sure that was from the world, or that kind of thing. And that's not that's I mean, Tom's got a different argument to me. He's coming from a more secular angle. Um, but neither me nor Tom are saying everything good comes from Christianity. We're saying um, pretty much all our moral sensibilities have been shaped profoundly by 20 centuries of Christianization, and our very criteria for judging what's good and bad has been profoundly Christianized. But the church has gotten loads of things wrong, and and I sort of challenged Stephen Woodford to actually read the book that he was critiquing, Dominion, in which Tom Holland gives a very warts and all history of the church. And I try in my book to give a bit of a warts and all history of ways in which Christians have done appalling things. And so I go into inquisitions and I go into the Crusades and I talk about sexual abuse scandals and I talk about Galileo and all the sorts of things that people think about when they think about, hang on, I thought the church was the baddies. And, and sometimes the church have been far worse than you had ever imagined. Like, have you have you read any of the journals of the Crusaders in the 11th century and what they got up to? They were they were they were visiting pogroms on Jewish settlements on the way to Jerusalem as practice genocides for what they were going to do in just utterly appalling. And I challenged Stephen Woodford by at least, if you're not going to read any other part of Dominion, at least read his index and like even just go through the A's of the index, and you'll come across like anti-Semitism, and you'll come across like apocalypse and apocalyptic preachers and the way that they've whipped up violence in the name of Jesus, or the Albigensian Crusades, or any of the Crusades, and Christian history is full of terrible things. What do we do about that? I suggest three things, and one is. Um, Bust the myths, because there are a lot of myths about Galileo and all that affair, and there are myths about the Crusades, and there are myths about the Inquisition, and 3,500 people died in the Spanish Inquisition over about 350 years, um, and so people died at less of a rate than are put to death in the United States, under capital punishment laws. This is not to say that what the Spanish Inquisition did was right, but um, that was just a, a couple of days on a rainy weekend for one of Stalin's purges, or some of the bloodshed after Lenin, or during the French Revolution. Those numbers far outstrip any of the evils of the Inquisition, for instance. So you can bust the myths, and sometimes it's right to bust the myths, but that's not mainly where I camp out. You need to own what's crooked and insist on the straight line. And in saying that, I'm referencing C.S. Lewis, who said, when you look at evil in the world, you're looking at something's crooked, but you don't have an idea of crooked unless you've got an idea of straight. If there's no such thing as a straight line, then there is no such thing as a crooked line. Lines are just lines, and what do you expect? It is what it is. And in the same way, if you're looking at things that are truly evil with a capital E, you are assuming that there's something good with a capital G. And what Christians need to do when we look at whether it's the historic evils of, crusades or whatever, or if it's very contemporary evils, child sexual abuse scandals or whatever, we need to own what is utterly crooked about that and call evil evil, because these things truly are evil. But at some point, and it's very difficult pastorally and rhetorically to get this right. It's almost impossible to get pastorally and rhetorically right. But at some point, you need to insist on the straight line. What is it that makes the Crusades so evil? Well, you know what makes the Crusades so evil? It's the cross that they are wearing on their armbands. Crusader means cross bearer. It's just what the word means. And they were named Crusaders because they put a cross on their arms as they went and killed their enemies. And what makes the Crusades so wicked is they are doing so in the name of one who died for his enemies, and yet they are killing their enemies. That's what makes it so wicked. Because if you want to talk, death tolls, then the Muslim armies had killed a lot of people over the previous 4 centuries, of them occupying lots of lands, including Jerusalem. They killed a lot of people. Um, but it's worse when Christians do it, not because the death toll was higher. It wasn't. But it is worse when Christians do it because of the name in whom they are fighting. They are doing so in the name of one who said, "Put away your sword, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword." That's what makes it wicked. And with child sexual abuse, I mean, what makes that so wicked is it's not obvious. It would not be obvious to a Roman why Harvey Weinstein is a moral monster. It's not obvious why Jeffrey Epstein is a moral monster. It's not at all obvious necessarily to non-Christian or pre-Christian cultures why Jeffrey Epstein is a moral monster. It's not at all obvious, not at all. And if you think that it's obvious to all cultures in all times and places that Jeffrey Epstein is a moral monster, you don't know your history. You just don't. You just don't. What would they call Jeffrey Epstein in first century Rome? A senator. That's like just business as usual, right? But what is it that makes it so egregious, and so egregious when Christians do it and have done, and when Christians cover it up, as Christian churches and denominations have done, and that's just utterly appalling. But what makes it so appalling is that bodies are like temples; they're not like playgrounds, as Epstein thought, as the Romans thought. Bodies are like temples; they're not like playgrounds, and sex is significant. It's not just a leisure activity. And power differentials, the powerful are meant to serve the less powerful rather than use their strength to dominate. All these assumptions are the straight line by which we judge the Jeffrey Epsteins of this world as crooked, by which we judge Christian sexual abusers as wicked. And at some point, it's really difficult rhetorically, it's really difficult pastorally to get there. But at some point, the outrage you feel at sexual abuse, even if it's at the sexual abuse of a Christian, the outrage you feel is Christian outrage. And in my chapter on consent, I try and sort of get us there. And it's a long chapter and it's a brutal chapter in some ways. But at some point, I think that needs to be said so that you can say, therefore, your safe place is not in the structures of this world. And your safe place is not in the hands of men. Your safe place really is Jesus and Jesus alone. And he is the one who truly helps you to name the evil that sexual abuse is. And he is the one who is really the only truly safe man, the only truly safe place for those who have been so abused, and sometimes so abused in the name of Jesus. So there's a lot there, but I think those are some of the things you need to think about. We need to think about busting the myths. We need to think about owning what's crooked and insisting on the straight line, who is Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of why does church hurt and narcissism in church and those kind of
Mm.
power abuses happen? Why do they feel worse than any other place? And you could just say, well, people are people, and that's true to a certain extent, but no other organization is claiming to be, as NT Wright would say, a small working model of new creation. The football club down the road is not trying to be a small working model of
Right,
new creation.
right.
And that's why when it happens by Christians
Yeah,
in the name of Christianity,
yeah,
by people who are given the responsibility of leading in a Christian context, why it's worse. Even if comparatively to other areas, to the things happening in the world, it may not be as bad, but actually it's because it's in whose name we're doing it,
right.
and because we insist on the straight line. And I think you're absolutely right there. And I think it's something for us to think about, that how we as leaders stay close to we've got to stay close to the line ourselves. We can't just go, well, we're all, we're no better than anyone else, so let's not,
Mm.
all those kind of things.
Yes, yeah, we are meant to be those safe places. So yeah, yeah, you can't just camp out on nobody is safe, only Jesus. Well, you need the Christ of you need the Christ who is encountered in community with his people. And we must not let ourselves off the hook and say, well, no one could ever be a safe place. No, churches are called to be those safe places. And at some point, you need to say to people, look, you might have gone to a restaurant and gotten food poisoning, and I understand why you're not ready quite yet to go back to that restaurant right now because you got food poisoning at that restaurant, but you gotta eat, right? You gotta eat, and at some point you need to find a place to feed again, and you need to feed on Christ. And so, yeah, we do need to work hard as churches to be, as good a safe places as we can possibly be. And those who have been hurt do, it's a long journey, but do need to trust again um, in church because that's where Jesus wants to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been like a chocolate brownie covered in chocolate sauce with chocolate sprinkles on top. It has been absolutely brilliant. I just would recommend everyone to read your book, The Air We Breathe. Just fantastic. I've really enjoyed reading it. I've actually encouraged people in my church to read it. It's just been such a helpful book for so many people. So thank you for the time you've taken to write it and for your YouTube account as well, which it's just I find so helpful in helping me think through the situation we're in, the world, the situation of the world that we're in, and how we process that in a really Christ honoring way. And so thank you so much for your ministry and for your time today.
Oh, you're a great encourager. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you, Chris.
Brilliant. Take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of That CPD Show. For more episodes, why not subscribe and give us a review? It really helps us out. See you next time.